Greetings to you all in the mighty name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We thank God, our Maker, that we are still alive despite the challenges facing the world due to this pandemic, which is called COVID-19 pandemic. On this video, we will briefly discuss the connection between the Bible, freedom, and democracy. The connection between the Bible, freedom, and democracy. Yes, that's what we are discussing, the connection between the Bible, freedom, and democracy. Now, some argue that the basic principles of democracy are founded in the idea that each individual has a right to liberty. Each individual has a right to liberty. It is said that democracy extends the idea that each ought to be the master of his or her own life to the domain of collective decision making. Each ought to be the master of his or her life to the domain of collective decision making. First, each person's life is deeply affected by a large social, legal, and cultural environment in which he or she lives in. That's what affects us, basically, the social, legal, and cultural environments. Secondly, only when each person has an equal voice and vote in the process of collective decision making will each have control over their large environment or over this large environment. Now, some argue, in chapter 8 of his second treatise of government, John Locke, a 17th century British philosopher, says, God having made man such a creature that in his own judgment it was not good for him to be alone, put him under strong obligations of necessity, convenience, and inclination to drive him into society, as well as fitted him with understanding and language to continue and enjoy it. So John Locke, the British philosopher of the 17th century, recognizes that God has created us to live in a society, to live in a community. There's no one or people or human beings are not created to live in isolation. But also John Locke is reminding us that there is no freedom that is enjoyed in isolation, but it happens within a society or community. There's no way we can enjoy such in isolation. Now, let's talk about the Greek concept of freedom and democracy before we move on to the biblical one. The first known democracy, of course, was by the Greeks and its Athenians, to be more specific. Greeks defined to be free as to be at one's own disposal. They defined to be free as to be at one's own disposal. In the Greek world, this was in contrast with the bondage of the slave. As you know, to be a slave means you belong to someone else. You are a property of someone. Someone owns you. Whereas to be free, you belong to yourself. So those are the two constructing views. To be a slave, you belong to someone, but to be free, you belong to yourself. So Greeks further believed that a state with a democratic constitution is the best guarantee of freedom because fundamentally and in actual political life, it allows to all citizens the same political freedom or same political rights. For Greeks, democracy is seen at work and democracy is seen at work, and freedom is given vivid form in the free speech of the citizen. Voting is considered to be part of the free speech. As you know, to vote means to give a voice on or about something. It means to have an opinion and also means to resolve or give a verdict or reach a decision. That's what it means to vote. Democracy, this word, by the way, is a Greek word coming from two words. It's in Greek. It's called demokratia, which comes from the word demos, which means people, and kratos, which means rule. Demos, people, kratos, rule, meaning people rule. So democracy is a form of government in which the people have authority to choose leaders to govern them. It is a method of group decision making characterized by a kind of equality among the participants at an essential stage of the collective decision making. Strategically, democracy has an advantage because it forces decision makers to take into account the interests, the rights, and opinions of most people in the society, which doesn't happen with any other form of government. Now, since democracy gives some political power to each, more people are taken into consideration than under aristocracy, that being the privileged ruling class, or monarchy, that being the royal family ruling the people and making decisions on their behalf without considering them. So, in a democratic state, people do have some political power to basically take decisions. But the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, in his book Republic, book number 4 of the Republic or Republic, has a negative view on democracy. He argues that democracy is inferior to various forms of monarchy, aristocracy, and even oligarchy on the grounds that democracy tends to undermine the expertise necessary to properly govern a society. He argues that democracy neglects the expertise necessary to properly govern a society. He says that in a democracy, those who are expert at winning elections and nothing else will eventually dominate democratic politics. Democracy, according to him, tends to emphasize this expertise at the expense of the expertise that is necessary to properly govern a society. So, what is important, according to him, in democracy is the expertise at winning elections. Democracy doesn't consider any other thing except that those are the winning people. So for him, the reason for this is that most people do not have the kinds of talents and faculties that enable them to link or to think well about the difficult issues that politics involves. He considers that in a democratic state or democratic processes, people don't have the intellect to think freely and to think wisely about how they should execute their voting. So he argues that those that should vote are those that have been taught on how to vote, or those that are educated. Would you agree with him? But we've seen this happening in our country, where those that are more vocal and are good at organizing branches and so on, and speaking the rhetoric that the people would love, are the ones that are voted. We've seen this happening in our country. We've seen this happening in other countries like the US. So the notion of democracy has evolved over time considerably. And generally, there are at least two kinds or two types of democracy, and that being the direct and the representative democracies. In a direct democracy, the people directly deliberate and decide on legislation or rule of the law. Whereas in a representative democracy, the people elect representatives to deliberate and decide on legislation or rule of law, such as in parliament or presidential democracy. I would like to believe that in South Africa, we have what may be called, or what is called, liquid democracy, which is a combination of both direct democracy and representative democracy. For instance, we elect party. We elect a party that would like to govern us. Now, that party elect representatives that will go and represent us in parliament. Now, these representatives, on behalf of the party, they deliberate on legislation or rule of law, but before a particular legislation is decided or and promulgated or declared, the parliament gives us a chance as a people or as citizens to comment on that particular legislation before it is finalized and signed by the president. So I would like to believe in South Africa we have what is called liquid democracy. Now, having explained democracy from a Greek perspective and in our contemporary understanding, I would like us also to consider the biblical concept of freedom and democracy. And we'll start by looking at the Old Testament. The Old Testament, or the Bible, does not use the word democracy, but it gives us ideas on such, and frequently it does speak about freedom. In the book of Exodus, for instance, we read about freedom that the Israelites cried for and God granted them through the leadership of Moses. This story, which we read in Exodus chapters 1 to 14, is a story for wanting to be freed from external forces that oppresses us or oppresses oneself from pursuing one's life in a manner that is free from someone's force. It is a story of personal freedom, but also a story of community freedom, because our freedom is always tied up together. It is also in the Old Testament that we read in Leviticus 25, verse 10, that freedom must be declared to all in the land. All, not some, but all. Black and white, green and yellow, all. Heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, all. Male and female, all. Freedom must be declared to all that live in the land. But also, freedom is not meant for a select few. That's what God is telling us in Exodus, Leviticus 25, verse 10. And we also see that freedom is associated with having land, or land being returned to the original owners. That's what we see in the biblical narratives. In a nutshell, though, here God says, proclaim freedom for all those live in the land, rich, poor, young, old, women, men, straight and not so straight, black, white, citizens and foreigners. And God says, land must be returned to the original owners. A very difficult task in our country, I must say. If we read the story of the Israelites, we see that the people must be set free before the formation of a democratic state or institutions. In Deuteronomy 16, verse 18, we see that once the Israelites were freed, God gave them the authority to practice democracy by electing leaders and make judicial appointments with the mandate to render just decisions on behalf of the people. It is a biblical or godly mandate for our leaders and judicial appointments to make just decisions on behalf of the whole people, not on behalf of the elite or select people, select few, but they must make just decisions for all. The first Samuel chapter 8, we find Israelites exercising their democracy by opting to have a king to rule over them. This, of course, was a decision that was taken after Samuel's two sons, who Samuel had appointed as judges, took bribes and perverted justice. This was their justification for wanting to have a king. The Israelites decided on that these judges are corrupt. They take bribes and pervert justice. Therefore, we need to have a king. God was against their decision, or God was against rather with their request, but he granted it with a stern warning what kings will do to them. God wants them what kings will do to them. Democracy that is detached from the will of God tends to be harmful for the people or citizens, just like we see in the pages of the Old Testament. When the Israelites were ruled by kings, things were not so nice. When the Israelites were ruled by the will of the king, not the will of God, things were not so good for them. So we are called to mean a democracy that is aligned to the will of God. But we must also recognize something. We must also recognize something that the omnipotent God, whose power is unlimited, does respect the will of the people, even when people are wrong in their democratic practice. We must be aware when we seek freedom that we also don't seek freedom from God's dominion. That's what we are called. But if we move forward to the New Testament, the concept of freedom reaches new heights in the New Testament, which, with the incarnation of Jesus Christ, remember in Greek philosophy and political culture, freedom means being in control of yourself. In the Old Testament means that you must be in control of yourself. But however, it is also advanced on how to live in a democratic, godly state or community. Here in the New Testament, freedom means we attain self-control by letting ourselves to be controlled. So freedom in the New Testament is not just about controlling yourself, but letting the other to control you, letting God to control you. It is about letting Christ to be in control of your life and my life. That's what freedom is about in the New Testament. We see this in John chapter 8, verses 31 to 36, where Christ asserts himself as the truth that set us free from sin, which is slavery. By letting ourselves to be controlled by Christ, he in turn frees us or releases us in a true sense of being freed. St. Paul in Romans 6, verses 18 to 23, speaks about this, saying, being controlled by God gives us freedom from sin. In the New Testament, freedom is not just it's not just limited to being freed or free from external powers or forces that dominate or control us and limit our pursuit of happiness. But freedom is freedom from an existence which is sin that leads us to death. So in the New Testament, freedom is freedom from sin, which is freedom from human beings' physical desire for life, for himself. We are being freed from desiring life for ourselves, but desiring life as a people, desiring life to be lived within Christ, within the will of God. To be in sin, then, is to be in deception, in falsehood. To be in falsehood is not to be free. To exist without God means to regard oneself as God. And this implies blindness to one's own true reality. The truth that life comes from God is suppressed when we want to live without God. Falsehood is pursued in the persistent attempt at self rule. So, self rule is not good for us. When one allows him or herself to be controlled by Christ, Christ frees, or rather, those people freeze themselves because Christ has taken control of their lives. They free themselves from the sin and self deception of autonomous existence. Once we allow them to be controlled by Christ, our freedom is exercised in a godly manner. In Acts chapter 26, verse 10, we see that Paul had the power to vote, to exercise his democratic right, and to exercise that power by sentencing Christians to death. He sentenced Christians to death. His freedom was without God. But once he had freedom that comes from Christ, he no longer was part of a regime that crucified and martyred Christians. We also see that the apostles Take a vote in Acts chapter 1, verse 26, in order to fill the seat vacante, the vacant seat left by Judas. Here, the exercise of freedom is done in a godly manner for the good of the spreading of the gospel of Christ to all the nations. Here we see indeed that freedom and democracy can be meant for the good, but also can be meant for the evil. This happens, I contest, when this is done with or without freedom that comes from Christ. So, in conclusion, we are to seek freedom, political freedom, but to go beyond that by seeking freedom from sin. That's what we are called to do. We are called to practice democracy, which is informed by freedom that comes from Christ, because such freedom that comes from Christ, this allows us from being controlled or being in control, but gives the control to God, who created us in his image, both male and female. So once we allow Christ to be in control by giving us true freedom, we will live in safer homes, communities, and in a safer country. We will elect good leaders, and our leaders will be just on their decisions made on our behalf. Our country will be free from corruption, and all her people, I contest, will be treated with fairness and will be equal before the law. Bishop Tom says in one of his books, true freedom is the gift of the Spirit, the result of grace, but precisely because it is freedom for as well as freedom from. That's what Bishop Tom Wright says. May God grant us true freedom, which comes from giving control to Christ and allowing ourselves to be controlled by Christ. God bless us all. Thank you. Keep safe and practice safer democracy.